So moral pluralism is really very similar to a previous video that I just did, which was moral particularism. I mean, it's not exactly similar, but it leads to relativism the same way moral particularism does. They both take risks sliding away from fundamental universal principles into a relativistic abyss. If the world is so subjectively relative that Mandela can be seen as Hitler, or Hitler can be seen as the modern day Superman, if there's no issues with that, we wouldn't even have enough moral guidance to get through our daily lives. There are those who live as if this were true, and those are the people that we have to be guarded against. Those are either people that don't care about evaluating consequential outcomes, which is the apex of dangerous behavior, or they live by rigid moralities in which either the ends justify the means or the means justify the ends. But we have to talk about practical wisdom, similar to Aristotle's phronesis. There's a situational balance that neither cleaves to hard, rigid moral rules, nor discards them for relativism and opportunism. It's a balance between consequential outcomes and current situational conditions. But the argument is often about the goal. People will set selfish goals, not caring about the outcome for others. The universal utility always tries to maximize everything for everybody. When can we ever deviate from this? Never. We can never deviate from that kind of outcome. Anybody who does it is immediately criminal. Criminal in a sense that's deeper than legal. We can never sidestep universal utility for any reason. There's a lot of arguments about short-term versus long-term gain, but those arguments are only valid in the context of trying to meet the everybody wins scenario. Let's talk about moral pluralism. Moral pluralism is the philosophical perspective that acknowledges the coexistence of multiple, equally valid moral principles or ethical systems. It contrasts with moral monism, which asserts that there's a single overarching moral truth, and moral relativism, which suggests that moral truths are entirely dependent on cultural or individual perspectives. Key features of moral pluralism. Recognition of diverse values. It accepts that different moral frameworks such as utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics may each offer valid insights into what is right or wrong. Conflict of values. It acknowledges that moral values can sometimes conflict with one another, such as when justice and compassion point toward different courses of action. No absolute hierarchy. While it accepts multiple moral truths, it does not establish a rigid hierarchy among them. Instead, the importance of values may vary depending on the context. This is where I would say the universal principle applies always. So the problem with moral pluralism is that it would try to eliminate that universal principle in trying to determine which ethic applies to the situation, because you always have to evaluate the individual situation, and then basically moral pluralism says you'll go through the different ethics and figure out which one does what. You don't know because you haven't set the goal of universal necessity. But moral pluralism says there is no goal. So how do you even determine which ethic to switch between? You can't, because you have no goal. And this is really the problem, is that people make these ideas and they don't keep in mind that there has to be a goal, and that goal has to be universal necessity or everything for everybody, or a win-win scenario at first choice. Of course, that's very rarely ever the case. We have to do triage situations that deviate from the ideal, but we should never lose sight of that. We should never lose sight of that universality, that win-win scenario, which means that moral pluralism itself is questionable in that you'd have to add something else in order to even use moral pluralism to guide yourself through situations, because you don't know what the goal is. The goal could just be to get as much as I can for myself, like it is for some people. Mediation and balance. In cases of conflict, moral pluralism often calls for practical reasoning or dialogue to balance competing values without rejecting any outright. Multiple valid moral views. There's no single absolute moral truth. Instead, there can be multiple equally valid moral perspectives. That's the problem. Moral conflict. Different moral values can conflict with each other. For example, the value of honesty may conflict with the value of kindness. Respect for diversity. Moral pluralists respect the diversity of moral opinions and beliefs. They recognize that people may have different moral frameworks and that these frameworks are equally valid. And see, that's leaning more into relativism, because you can also say that people's frameworks create destructive behaviors, and no one ever talks about that. Open-mindedness. Moral pluralists are often open-minded to different moral perspectives. They are willing to consider the merits of different viewpoints, even if they disagree with them. Tolerance. Moral pluralists are tolerant of people who hold different moral beliefs. They do not seek to impose their own moral views on others. Also a problem, because if people are hurting people from within a culture, in a human sense, we have to be critical, if not step in and prevent that. Moral pluralism, while appealing to inclusivity and flexibility, faces several criticisms. One key issue is its lack of clear guidance for resolving conflicts between competing moral principles. Without a hierarchy or established criteria, moral pluralism can lead to indecision or inconsistent judgments, as it offers no definitive way to prioritize values such as justice and compassion in a given scenario. Additionally, critics argue that it risks sliding into moral relativism, where the equal validity of all moral frameworks makes it difficult to condemn harmful practices, potentially justifying oppressive traditions under the guise of respecting diversity. And here we have the paradox of tolerance. Furthermore, applying moral pluralism in practical contexts can be cumbersome, as balancing complex values often leads to subjective or arbitrary resolutions. Its boundaries are also ambiguous. If moral pluralism claims to accept all perspectives, it must grapple with how to handle ideologies that promote harm or oppression, which challenges its inclusivity. Moreover, the attempt to accommodate conflicting values can result in moral compromises that fail to strongly uphold any principle, weakening ethical outcomes. Lastly, by rejecting the idea of a single moral truth, moral pluralism undermines universal moral claims, complicating efforts to advocate for a global ethical standard like universal human rights. This is all like child's play knowledge. It feels like so many people don't understand this, and it's like, why do I have to tell you this? These criticisms highlight the difficulty of using moral pluralism as a reliable framework for consistent and practical ethical decision making. Don't listen to relativists. Don't listen to people who lean into contextual approaches too much. Of course, context has to be considered, but never to the level of the rejection of universal human utility and universal human necessity. We see nothing but bad things from that in history. That goes for individuals, that goes for groups, that goes for states, that goes for religions, that goes for international entities. Avoid suffering and promote flourishing for the most people possible. Win-win. Everything for everybody. Never forget that. That's always the goal. There's a lot about shooting for the middle, then focusing on putting a floor under the bottom. If you guys like this kind of philosophical subject matter, help us out by liking the video and subscribing to the channel.